What is up, everybody? It's me, Dan, moderately anonymous MTG, and we are back today with some more of the greatest cEDH content in the multiverse. We are here today doing a deck tech for a new Dimir Scepter Commander, Raul Trouble Shooter from the new Fallout set. Quickly, before we hop into the deck tech, y'all know the deal. Sponsors of the show, TCG, Player Dragon Shield. Go head up our Patreon to give direct support to the show, get access to our private Discord and a bunch of bonus content here on YouTube, and of course, Bonfire for the merch. All of those links are right in the video description below. Now let's go hop into the deck tech. So, of course, the first question to answer is, why Raul? What makes Raul good and what makes Raul unique? Raul, of course, is a 1/4 for 1 in Dimir mana, and says once during each of your turns you may cast a spell from among cards in your graveyard that were milled this turn, and it also has a tap ability that says tap, each player mills a card. The one aspect of this card that I really like is the fact that it is in and of itself a win con. If you have ISO Rev out on the table, Raul mills the whole table. It's just like using Brain Freeze, which is great. Love to have a win con at the command zone. That's a really great use for it, but I also really love the incidental value that you get off this card. Both of these lines of text, super relevant. So the top line of text, almost a mini Yawgmoth's Will. We don't get to play lands that we mill, but if we mill any spells, and of course our deck is mostly spells, we just have the ability to tap Raul to essentially draw an extra card every turn. Now that's great, but what really pushes this for me is the fact that it can combine with top deck tutors like Vampiric Tutor, Imperial Seal, and you're going to see that we're even on Scheming Symmetry to be able to put things on top of our library, mill them with Raul, and be able to cast them immediately, essentially turning all of our top deck tutors into a 1-mana demonic tutor. Now, of course, besides milling out the table with Raul's ability, we can also use Raul as a Yawgmoth's Will. Of course, we do have to work around the confines of what's on the card, so we can only do it once each turn, and we can only do it on cards that were milled this turn. Now, of course, we have ways of working on both of these confines to be able to cast pretty much everything in our deck. The first is that we're using mass mill strategies like Basalt Monolith plus Mesmeric Orb, Encephalid Illusionist plus Lightning Greaves, alongside our ISO Rev combo to be able to mill everything from our library in one fell swoop. Then, with Displacer Kitten, every time we cast a non-creature spell out of our graveyard, we're going to blink Raul, and Raul is going to come back in. That's going to allow us to use his ability to cast cards from the graveyard again. He's still going to recognize that they were milled, but since Raul is a new object, he's going to allow you to use that ability to cast a spell again. A couple other quick notes about Raul and how this ability works. If we mill over a spell, say like Ad Nauseam, we cast the Ad Nauseam using Raul's ability and it gets countered, it is going to go back to your graveyard. It's not flashback, it's not any kind of ability like that that's going to exile it if it would go anywhere else. You're just casting it from your graveyard as if it was an extension of your hand, so it's going to go back to your graveyard. And another note, if you cast a spell, say it's Ad Nauseam, that resolves or doesn't resolve, goes back to your graveyard, it's no longer going to be recognized as milled. If you were to cast a Mana Rock, say, and then grind it away with Grinding Station, putting it back in your graveyard, that's also going to no longer be recognized as a milled card. Once the card changes zones, it's no longer going to be recognized as having been milled. So let's look into the different ways that we can win with this deck. Like we said, the first is that we're going to combine the cards Isochron Scepter and Dramatic Reversal, and there's a few reasons that you don't see this combo very often, and it's because in my opinion, it's not a great combo. It doesn't work under Collector Oof, it doesn't work under Draenith Magistrate. There's a lot of different ways that you can interact with this combo. It is a very all-in combo because you're going to imprint one of your combo pieces, which means you're going to exile it under this Isochron Scepter. So if Isochron Scepter gets bounced back to your hand, if it gets destroyed with an Abrupt Decay, your Dramatic Reversal is gone forever. You're going to need to pivot onto a different plan. Luckily for us, we do have a few other backup plans to win with this deck, and they're all sort of interwoven and dovetailed in a really nice way that I like. So these other modes are going to be able to mill our entire deck, but not our opponent. So we're going to have to win with our own deck, but again, that's not going to be a problem when we have access to all of it. Our backup artifact combos are Mesmeric Orb and Basalt Monolith. Mesmeric Orb says that whenever a permanent becomes untapped, that permanent's controller mills a card. Basalt Monolith taps for 3 mana and has an ability to untap itself for 3 mana. That's going to trigger the Mesmeric Orb, and we can rinse and repeat as many times as we have cards in our library. And our last combo, which is a semi-artifact combo because there's a creature involved in it as well, is Cephalid Illusionist plus Lightning Greaves. When Cephalid Illusionist is targeted by a spell or ability, you mill the top 3 cards of your library. Lightning Greaves, of course, is an equipment that has an equip ability for 0. So what we're going to do is spam that over and over again. Now, the trick for this is that we're going to need a second creature to equip the Lightning Greaves to, since Lightning Greaves gives the equipped creature Shroud. If that were hexproof, we'd simply be able to just spam the targeting trigger on Cephalid Illusionist over and over again. But because it has Shroud, we're going to need a second creature to bounce the Lightning Greaves back and forth between. So this is another combo that has a lot of interaction points, but the end result is going to be, again, that we mill our entire library. Once we mill our library over, the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to get one free creature, that's Narcomoeba. Next, depending on what our board state looks like, there's a couple of different ways that we can go to try to enact a combo. If we have the mana for it, we can pay the disturb cost on Malevolent Hermit. have it come back as Benevolent Geist, since we're using the ability of the card itself. This isn't going to count towards Raul's ability. And the same is true of Fate Stitcher, which we can unearth for a single blue mana. If we have the mana to get all of these on board, or if we just happen to have 3 creatures on board, we're going to be able to, again, not using Raul's ability, but on the ability of the card, use the flashback cost on Dread Return. Dread Return can bring back Displacer Kitten, then we start spamming our 0 mana artifacts, we continue to blink Raul, we make a bunch of mana, we use any of our win cons from there, Thassa's Oracle, Praetor's Grasp, or any other win con that we might have to use. If we don't have a critical mass of creatures on board for their Dread Return, or if we don't have the mana to bring back these other creatures, one thing that we can do is use Raul's ability to cast Reanimate. Reanimate is going to be a single shot to either bring back Displacer Kitten if we have some more spells in our hand that we can start going off with, or it can bring back Hullbreaker Horror, which requires a similar caveat. We need to have artifacts on board that we can go infinite with, and or a spell in hand that we can cast to start triggering its ability. But these are some less mana intensive ways of starting to go off from the graveyard. So once we've got our entire library into the graveyard, what is the plan from there? Probably the easiest way to win is to cast Rocks and Rituals, cast Yawgmoth's Will from our graveyard, and then we can go for a Thassa's Oracle win. The reason why we want to cast the Yawgmoth's Will first is because that's going to give us access to all of the counters in our graveyard without needing to blink Raul in between with Displacer Kitten where opponents can interact. We also have Defense Grade in our main deck, which helps a lot in that endeavor, and I have a Conqueror's Flail on the sideboard. I really want to find a spot for it in the main deck, but these spots are really tight, so if you have suggestions for it, let me know. Taking a peek through the rest of the deck list, we've got Tezzeret the Seeker in our Planeswalker slot. This is a really great way to, one, ramp with that plus ability, and the minus ability gets just about every combo piece in our deck. The reason that I really wanted to use this over a spell like Whir of Invention in its place is for the fact that we can blink it with Displacer Kitten. Being able to blink the Tezzeret and go get more artifacts means that we're very likely to be able to piece together our A+B artifact combos. In the creature section, we've talked about most of them already. Dathli Voidwalker, great card, doesn't need an introduction. We're a mill deck, we're trying to mill our opponents, so we definitely don't want them to have options from the graveyard. And best case scenario, we mill all of our opponents and then we get one of their juicy cards, say their Underworld Breach or something, make our wins extra easy. Spellseeker is an extra body for our Dread Return effects and also gets a lot of really great tutors in the deck, including all of our top deck tutors, which of course work with Raul like we said as a demonic tutor. Spellskite covers all of our bases in protection. It protects our artifacts from artifact removal, protects our creatures from creature removal, just a great protection spell in this deck. In the sorcery slot, some of our spiciest are the Scheming Symmetry, not a card that you see a whole lot, but of course we're able to use our top deck tutors a lot quicker and a lot better than our opponents can. Dread Return, of course, for our mill combos, like we said before. Mnemonic Betrayal needs no introduction again, just a great card in Dimir colors. Of course, it works with our commander if we are only doing a finite amount of milling or an infinite amount of milling. It's just one of the many ways that we can win from that point. Praetor's Grasp is really great in this deck. I love it for low color decks that have very finite win conditions. Pretty much our only win condition in this deck is our Thassa's Oracle. So if Thassa's Oracle gets exiled or for some other reason we can't cast it, we have very finite options. Being able to use a Praetor's Grasp to go into our opponent's deck and be able to get their Thassa's Oracle, or maybe their Underworld Breach, since we're also on Brain Freeze in this deck, becomes a very crucial option to have in certain situations. Raul is of course a 1/4, so we have a lot of leeway with our Toxic Deluge, being able to cast it up to X3 without killing Raul, which is pretty awesome. That takes care of Tyrannith Magistrates, it takes care of Najeela and all of her warriors and more aggressive decks like that. Takes care of Tymna and Tymna attackers, a lot of different stat creatures for the most part. We don't get Chroms, we don't get, I think maybe Eidolon of Rhetoric has 4 toughness, but we're able to get most things without killing Raul, which is really sweet. Transmute Artifact, again, a very great dovetailed tutor in this deck, goes and gets a lot of different combo pieces and a lot of different value pieces. In our instance and sorcery slots, we have got, of course, Ad Nauseam. This isn't the greatest Ad Nauseam deck that you've ever seen. No, Dimir deck really is, but we are filled to the gill with ramp in this deck, and especially artifact ramp, so we do have a little bit of a better shot than I would say the average Dimir deck of going off with Ad Nauseam. Brain Freeze, of course, awesome in this deck. Not only can this be a mass draw spell, but this can also be a win condition. Super sweet slot in this deck. I really love Brain Freeze for it. Dramatic Reversal, again, of course, one of our win cons, but can also be a ritual spell. Don't bat your eye at that. Being able to cast it from the graveyard as a ritual spell is something that you can do. Muddle the Mixture here goes and gets almost all of our different win cons. It can't get a Basalt Monolith, but it can get either a Cephalid Illusionist or the Lightning Greaves. It can get a Mesmeric Orb or an Isochron Scepter, and of course you can just get things like Thassa's Oracle, Tainted Pact, Demonic Tutor. It can get a lot of really key pieces in this deck, so Muddle the Mixture is a really sweet slot. We were a pretty an all-in combo deck, and while I don't love Pact of Negation in most decks these days, I think this is a perfect pack deck, and the same thing with Spell Pierce. In the artifact section, we do have a huge amount of artifacts. Citadel is another grinding engine for this deck. Again, we have so much artifact ramp that it's not too hard to cast a Bolas of Citadel, and because we're a little bit extra stacked on our top deck tutors, it makes Bolas of Citadel even that much better. Defense Grid, of course, along with our counter suite, helps protect our win cons. Grinding Station, really sweet in this deck, with Raul on board basically turning every artifact drop into a draw 3. Lion's Eye Diamond might be seen as a little bit atypical for this style of deck because we are not on Underworld Breach, but because we're milling and we're going to be casting things from outside of our hand, Lion's Eye Diamond essentially becomes a Black Lotus in this deck once we're using Raul's ability to cast cards from the graveyard. Mesmeric Orb can be very risky, especially when so much of the meta is on Breach, but this is just such a powerful engine for this deck. It's really cheap to cast. Being able to cast this off of a Mana Crypt or an Ancient Tomb is really sweet, and it really powers up Raul very quickly. Of course, the One Ring, value engine, no introduction needed. Wishclaw Talisman, it's a tutor, it's an artifact, shoe in, great, we love it. In the enchantment section, we have Animate Dead, which is probably the most atypical thing here. Of course, we got Mr. Cremora and our Rhystic Study, but for the Animate Dead, we're doing a lot of milling, and Animate Dead not only can take things from our own graveyard, but importantly from other people's graveyards as well. So if we're milling with Raul and we hit someone else's Dockside Extortionist, for example, or something else really juicy, we're able to pick those out of the yard with our reanimation effects in Animate Dead and Reanimate. And then in the land slots, pretty usual. Of course, we're a Tana Pack deck, so we've got to have one of each. We are rocking a basic island and a basic swamp. I'm not a huge fan of running basics, even in a 2-color deck, but our mana base is pretty tight, and I'm glad with how it looks. We've got Ancient Tomb, we've got City of Traders to help gas us out a little bit. We've got as many 5-color lands as I thought was feasible for this deck. Gemstone Mine, right on the cusp because we're not really that quick of a deck. We're more of a turn 4 to 5 deck, but we've got Glimmer Void and Spire of Industry to take advantage of the fact that we have a lot of artifacts in the deck. Takenuma is technically a swamp that allows us to mill 3 cards in a pinch. Similar situation with Cephalid Coliseum. This is not a mill, but it is a draw and discard 3, which obviously we have a lot of ways to utilize cards being in our graveyard. And the spiciest bit of tech that we have in the land slot is Manamo School at Water's Edge. So this is basically an island, but we can pay a blue and tap it to untap target legendary permanent. So what do we have for legendary permanents? Of course, we've got our legendary commander Raul, but it also untaps the One Ring, which is very sweet. Being able to double up on those activations, I don't need to tell you that drawing 6 cards in a turn is awesome. Similarly, with our Fate Stitcher slot, being able to untap a target permanent, we not only get to untap Raul in the One Ring, but we also get to untap Wishclaw Talisman, the activation for which is paying 1 mana, tapping it, and removing a Wishclaw counter from it. So we can activate it, put a search on the stack, and then use Fate Stitcher to untap the Wishclaw Talisman, pay another mana, tap it again, and now we've got 2 demonic tutors on the stack, which is pretty sweet. Fate Stitcher can also help with permanents like Grinding Station, Basalt Monolith, Grim Monolith, Mana Vault, or even small time stuff like Soul Ring or a Mox Opal just to get an extra push on mana. In our sideboard slot, so if you look through our pile here, we've got the Conqueror's Flail. This is like top of my list of cards that I really want to get into the main deck, but I'm not sure where it's supposed to go yet. Doomsday is one that I thought pretty hard about since we have Raul as a way to crack our Doomsday pile. I think ultimately for a Doomsday build, this requires a different build of this deck than what this one looks like. I think that kind of a deck does want lines like the Legacy Doomsday deck has, where we were running cards like Deep Analysis. We've got some mass mill effects like Traumatize and Cut Your Losses is the other one from New Capenna. These cards are really sweet. It's a mass draw effect, but if we spend that much mana and Raul only allows us to cast 1 of the cards, it makes it a little tough, because if we don't hit pretty much exactly the card that we need to overcome the mana hump, it's going to be tough to do a lot with having milled half of our library in 1 turn. And once we mill it, we only have access to it for that 1 turn. That's what ultimately made me settle on the ISO Rev and the Mesmeric Orb lines. They're 2-card combos, but they're smaller pieces and much less mana intensive. Some other things I've thought about is an Agatha's Soul Cauldron package. It is possible that you could do things like Razaketh or something like that in this deck, mill it over with Raul, and then use Agatha's Soul Cauldron to make Raul into Razaketh or other things like that. Again, I think that requires a different build of this deck. We've only got, I think, 11 creatures in our main deck right now, so it's just not enough to really consistently go off with Razaketh, but that is another idea ahead, and I think there are probably even better ideas than Razaketh for that kind of line. Gale is something else I thought about, but again, this is something that seemed a little bit fatty and a little bit too mana intensive at the end of the day. Glimpse the Unthinkable is cute. It's a nice little one-shot, draw 10, but I think it's just not ultimately a good enough slot for a cEDH deck. Resculpt is pretty much one of the last slots that I cut from the deck, and one of the reasons why I really like Resculpt for this deck is that this deck folds hard to Grafdigger's Cage. It's possible that it also folds to Curse Totem depending on the line that you're going for, but basically my thought process is that Resculpt takes care of a lot of problematic creatures like Drannith Magistrate or Collector Oof, and also the problematic artifacts that stop us from winning like the Grafdigger's Cage, Curse Totem, etc. But if we look at our main deck and what we do still have, we've got Cyclonic Rift, we've got Chain of Vapor. For creatures, we've got a fair bit of removal, including stack interaction. Hullbreaker Horror is a way that we can go that pretty much dumps on all of those hate strategies. It doesn't really matter if we can't tap our Mana Crypt for mana if we're just using it to cast for free and then bounce a Collector Roof. And likewise, if we're only 1 spell away from bouncing a Grafdigger's Cage or a Curse Totem, we're in pretty good condition. Not to mention that at the end of the day, we do just also have the most concise win con in the book. We've got Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation that we can always go for. Raul being a win condition in the command zone is obviously great, obviously why we're playing the deck, but of course, you can never deny the power of just being able to pay 3 mana and win the game. Well, that's everything we got for Raul Millstorm. I hope that y'all liked the deck. This was a really fun one to put together. I'm really excited about this deck. I'm definitely going to give it a shot. Of course, the link to this deck is in the video description below. Go check it out. Let me know if you were excited about any Fallout cards. Let me know if there are any changes that you would make to this deck. If you got any ideas for that Agatha Soul Cauldron package or anything else, let me know in the comments. I hope that y'all had a good time watching today. If you made it this far, I bet you did. If you did, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. Go leave a comment for us. It's really helpful with the YouTube algorithm. Thank y'all so much for hanging out with us today. We'll catch you next time.